All right, good morning, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the React hooks. In part one of our lecture, we're going to be talking about the useState hook. We're going to do a quick review over the virtual DOM. We'll then talk about what is useState, the actual function, and the factors that it returns. We'll talk about the different ways that we can utilize useState as an example. We'll see useState holding a primitive data type, and we'll see useState holding a complex data type, and how we can utilize this useState to add values, remove values, and also iterate through said values in order to generate JSX. All right. At this point, does anyone have any questions over the material that will be covered in part one? Perfect. Doesn't seem like we have any questions. Now, I do owe you guys a part regarding our Docker lecture, which I'm going to go ahead and talk about now. You can see here on the left-hand side, my npm project has not been installed. All right. How do I know this npm project has not been installed?
Module node is not listed in their folders.
There's
Nice.
no package.json or package. Yeah.
Nice. So there's no node modules. And then, like Alex said, there's also no package-lock JSON, right? Both of those things are missing. So I know that my npm project hasn't been installed. And I'm actually not going to install it into my local environment. You may ask yourself why, but we'll dive into that shortly. Now, when we created our Docker file holds the following: the version of node that it's going to be utilizing, the working directory where it's going to be copying all this information. Notice that it's copying package.json and then running npm install. Oh, what does that mean? Let's talk about Docker a little bit. Docker actually holds something called the Docker network, and it lives at the engine level. Now, the Docker network is designed to be able to host multiple containers. So far, the containers that we've been utilizing have been single purpose containers, which are either to run tests, maybe they were to run JavaScript, or maybe we'll utilize them to run Python. All right, now all of these were single living, meaning that once they served their purpose, they became terminated. We were done using them. All right, so we can go ahead and terminate them. Hey, all of these containers are terminated. Well, now this is the first time that we're going to be utilizing a container that we need to continue to keep alive. All right, and this container, which will continue on living, is meant to be our React container. Now, our container is currently living inside of this Docker engine, otherwise known as the Docker network. But I want to be able to view all of the information that's inside of said container. Well, we actually have to add another layer on top of this, where this layer is our actual local machine. All right. So there's my local machine on the outside. I have my Docker engine running inside of my machine, and it holds all of these containers. I'm installing npm. So now my entire npm project is being installed. But note, it's not being installed inside of my machine. So when it generates node modules, those node modules exist in reference to the container. All right. So now we have node modules in reference to the container. that is tracking all of my information. And then finally, we want to run our React application. Well, my React application, when hosted, is living on port 5173, which is the exposed port of our container. All right, so we're telling this container here, hey, I want you to expose port 5173. All right. We'll talk about this dash dash host here in a little bit. But this is something that we've already seen. npm run dev actually runs our development server, right? Well, let's see how we're executing this Docker file now. I'm going to open up this run container sh. First, we're building our Docker image, which is fine, right? We're pretty familiarized with how this works. Does anyone have any questions over building a Docker image? Okay, perfect. After the build is complete, we're then going to run our container. Now, this dash dash rm flag, this stands for, hey, when this container is terminated, meaning that I stop the container, I want you to automatically remove it. Now, why is that important? Let's break that down really quick. Right now, if all of you have been utilizing Docker, if you come over to your terminal and run docker ps, you're going to see nothing pop up, all right? But now if you run docker ps-a, this is to show you all of your containers that are currently being kept record of. You can see that there's quite a bit of them. All right. And all of these are being generated with Python commands. So I could tell that this is just from OOP week, all the times that I was executing OOP within containers. Right? And now all of these containers are living. It goes all the way back to even a PyTest image. And I think the oldest one that I have falls to a testing image. And I believe this was when we were covering continuous integration with GitHub Actions. All right. So there's a living record of all of my containers. These occupy space. So typically you want to add this dash dash rm flag to be able to remove containers as soon as they're done with their functionality. All right. So there's one. Now this next flag stands for port. We're tying port 5173, which is in my machine. And I am tying it to the Docker engines port 5173. All right. Now that is an effort to try to actually access my React container. So currently my React container is on port 5173. All right. We can see that there. React is hosted in 5173. React container is exposing 5173. And I'm connecting my machine to the Docker engine, port 5173. But notice the connections between my machine and the Docker engine. It's not connected to the Docker network, or excuse me, the Docker container itself. All right. This React container still is unaware of that connection between my machine and the Docker engine. So how do we fix that? Well, we fix that with this Docker file. This is where the dash dash host comes into play. All right. It identifies, hey, I need to occupy a level above me as well. So now when I run npm run dev, port 5173 of my React application takes over the container as it should, right? But because of this dash dash host, it says, wait, who's hosting me? Okay, the Docker engine is hosting me. I'm also going to take over their port 5173. And now everything's connected. All right, so this dash dash host connects our container to the engine 5173. And the dash P flag in our execution command or run command, I apologize, connects the machine to the Docker engine at port 51783. That way we can view our files. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding the remove flag or the port flag?
In the Docker file, there was another command that was just two dashes. Is that the same thing as the dash dash host?
Yes, that's just to signify a space.
Gotcha. Okay.
All right. Any other questions? Okay, doesn't seem like we have any other questions. So let's go ahead and continue talking about these flags that we're seeing here. Now, this dash V flag stands for volumes, meaning that we want to connect two directories working with one another. And currently, oh, I have my pencil, that's why. There you go. And currently, my machine inside of VS Code and somewhere in some sort of, and actually this might be better if I do it this way. Perfect. So my machine inside of VS Code in some sort of directory, I am holding my React application built with Vite. And this React application built with Vite, I need to insert it into the container. Gonna give myself a little bit more real estate here. Not only do I need to insert it into the container, but when I make changes, I don't want to have to rebuild my container over and over and over again, right? Because we already put it in my container whenever I ran that. Oh, actually, I never ran that copy command for copy all. So that's okay. Good. Where's my perfect? All right. I need to put it into my container, and then I need there to be a link between both of them so that any changes are reflected inside of the container itself. So how do we accomplish this? Well, we accomplish this by creating a link between the both. This here is called a volume. And what a volume does, it essentially keeps a memory track between both of them. So if there is a safe change within one of these two versions, the other one will adopt it. All right, that way I could continuously develop within my own machine. Let me go ahead and label this as a volume. All right, just like we do this with our app, we also do it with our node modules. We want to make sure that our node modules are included inside of this volume. Finally, because this is a container that we are going to be referencing, we give it a name so we can reference it whenever we want to stop it, and then the image that we want to execute. Okay, so let's run this. All right, currently I don't have my node modules, nor do I have package.json. When I execute run container, you can see that it's starting to build there. The build is now complete, and there is my server. Now, again, we can see here, it's running on localhost 5173. That's a reference to the container. It's also available in the network level in 5173. That's a reference to the Docker network. And then my port is tying it to 5173. So now, if I open up a new machine and I go to localhost 5173, we can see our Pokemon application from yesterday. Right? And this is coming from Docker, not the V development server that's inside of my local machine. All right. Does anyone have any questions over how we're utilizing Docker to be able to host our information?
So you would use Docker instead of V?
Preferably, you want to use Docker, and I want everybody to get familiarized with Docker. And we're not using it instead. I want to clarify that because we're still running Vite. We're just running Vite inside of Docker. All right. The reason why I want everybody to get accustomed to Docker, most development environments nowadays, or deployment environments, I apologize, are utilizing a container to be able to deploy your application. So the more you're able to develop within that container, by the time it comes to deployment, rather than having to containerize your application afterwards, your application has always been containerized. So we could just deploy that container, copy it down, and then run it. The same exact command that we're using here would be the same exact command that you run inside of your AWS instance where you're going to be hosting your application. Does that answer your question, Erica? Of
Yes, thank you.
course. Any other questions?
So how would you change it like from when you already have it set up in Vite? How would you change it then to the Docker?
Got it. So as of right now, we already have it set up in Vite, right? And if
Yes.
you want to change it to where you can utilize Docker, the only thing you have to do, or there's two things that you have to do. So you have to remove your node modules, and you also have to remove your package-lock JSON. Right? By removing both of those, it would be as if you've never installed your npm application. Once both of those are removed, you just simply grab this Docker file, this run container query, and then execute this run container shell. Once you execute this run container shell, this is going to build the image for you and then run your application within Docker. Is
Okay.
that your question, Ken?
Yes, and it won't like mess up any of the current files if I delete that stuff.
No. If you delete your node
Okay.
modules and your package-lock JSON, it won't crash your application. All right, you would just have to reinstall it. If you don't want to utilize Docker, you could just run npm install and you'll be good to go. If you do want to utilize Docker, don't install it. Let Docker take care of it.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course.
I got a question.
Yeah.
Um, so let's say you want to like add a library. Would you have to access the Docker container where Beat is running inside of to do like the npm install, or would you have to stop the container, install it in your package.json, and then rebuild the image?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you could do either or, both approaches still work. You could either access the Docker container itself and install something, or you can go ahead and handle it on the outside. So let's go ahead and take a look here. All right, so currently right now, the only dependency that we have is Axios. Let's say that I wanted to install something else from npm. I don't know. I can't think of a useless library that we could utilize.
How about the animations.css? I
Let's
was
see.
playing with that yesterday.
There's React animations. That's cool. Animate surge, framer motion. Why not? Let's say that we want to install framer motion. All right, we're not actually going to utilize. I'm just doing this as an example. In a separate terminal, notice that my application is still running inside of this container. Now, if I run docker ps, oh, that's important. The only container that shows up is my React container because it's currently living. And it shows me, hey, this is tied to 5173. All right, awesome. Now I want to enter this container and actually run some information. Well, what I can do is I can docker exec --it. I want to enter interactively to my React container in a bash environment. Maybe it's not --it, maybe it's -it. There you go. All right, so I want to docker exec -it. I want to execute a command interactively within my React container. Notice that I'm inside of a directory named app. If I run ls, here's all of my node modules. I have package.json, v, everything that I need here. All right. Well, let me go ahead and run npm install. And now when I install, I want to utilize something like framer motion. npm install motion. Nice. And I misspelled it. And now motion gets added into my dependencies. All right, so that's one way of doing it. You could just enter the container, add it, or you could just write it in here, close the container, and rerun the container. Let's talk about exiting out of here. You can type in exit. That will let me out. If I want to shut down my container, because that's something we just referenced right now, I could just run docker stop react container. And that will stop my Docker container. Now, if I run docker ps, it's no longer there. Did that answer your question, Alex?
Yes.
All right, awesome. Any other questions? Okay, perfect. Now we know how to work within Docker. And now that we know how to work within Docker, we can actually move forward and start talking about our use state hook today. Let me run my container really quick. All right, my container is working. I can come over to my Docker file, or excuse me, not my Docker file, to source, come to app. And let's say I want to update this information a little bit. Create Pokemon Project 2. Now Pokemon Project 2 is showing. So all of my updates are living and everything is connected, just the way I want to. All right. Now, yesterday we went over this GET request, and I'm going to actually start deleting a lot of the comments from yesterday because we're not going to be covering that information here. We were able to generate a card, grab some Pokemon data, and then generate some Pokemon. All right. Now, today we're going to start talking about the use state hook. But before we start talking about the use state hook, let's talk about why the use state hook. This is going to send us back to our lecture regarding the virtual DOM. All right, so the way live updates should happen inside of React is rather than interacting directly with the DOM, we should update the virtual DOM. Here we can see both of the H1 elements are the same. When we scroll down, the content of the H1 element has been changed to hello code platoon, and the content of the DOM are not the same. All right, they are no longer matching. Well, the DOM, excuse me, the virtual DOM inserts itself into the current DOM that's being read by the browser and forces it to match to one another. Well, what triggers this comparison? State hooks are what trigger this comparison. So we can utilize useState to do some action like this. And let's go ahead and see exactly that H1 element being changed. I'm going to go ahead and make a const. I'm going to name it header, set header. Make that equal into useState. And I'm going to change this to display the header. Now, additionally, I'm going to make a button. For this button is going to have the value of change header. And what we're going to do is we're going to add an onClick function that will set our header to I've been changed. Let me bring down that useState function so we can see it, because right now it's at the very top of our app. All right, so here's my useState function. Currently, I'm getting Corsair Pokemon Project 2. That is coming from my initial state of my hook of useState. But now notice when I click change header, that automatically changes to I've been changed. Well, what's going on there, right? Why is that happening? I didn't grab this element by ID. I didn't manipulate the DOM itself or iterate through the DOM tree. I'm quite literally just clicking a button and the content of that header is changing. Well, why? This is happening because of the useState hook. useState hook or changes. Let me write this in a multi-line string here. All right, so changes to a state hook. We'll just go ahead and call it a state. Will trigger the VDOM versus DOM comparison. So let's take a look here. When my application first renders, what is the value of my H1 header?
Hello world.
Right. And in this case, my value of the H1 header is Corsair Pokemon Project, right? Now, this is a state value. That state value is a header. And we can see it being activated here. And so here's my H1 header, which is coming from my state value. Now, in my virtual DOM, I am changing the value of that state to I've been changed. All right, header is now equal to I've been changed. So in the virtual DOM, this no longer matches what the DOM is currently rendering because the DOM had Corsair Pokemon Project. Once those two don't match, the virtual DOM inserts itself into the DOM and manually changes the DOM so that it actually matches. All right, so again, we're changing the value of the header state that causes the virtual DOM to insert itself into the DOM and force this change to have been changed. Does anyone have any questions regarding the virtual DOM comparison? We're still going to break down the useState hook a little bit longer. Okay, no one has any questions. So let's go ahead and talk about the useState hook itself. How does a use-state hook work? All right. What is this syntax and what is it actually returning? Well, in order for us to understand that, we actually understand what use state is. So use state is a function that takes in one parameter, where that parameter is the init value of the state. Right? So the initial value of header is Corsair Pokemon Project 2. And we could see that when I refresh the page. This is the initial value of header. It's not initialized as null. Now this function is going to do some logic, and then it's going to return a list, or excuse me, an array, where that array is going to have a getter and a setter. Now we've seen getters and setters before inside of object-oriented programming. That's what's happening in the useState function. So if this is returning a getter and a setter, what is header? Is that a getter or is that a setter?
A getter?
Yeah, so this is actually our getter. Right, so again, this is returns get, returns set, and this is init value. Very similar to class, right? So now we have our getter, our setter, and an initial value. And that's how the useState hook works. When I'm declaring this, I am destructuring the array that is returned and saving it under variable references. So I could reference the getter as header. Right? I'm storing that value of getter in the variable setter. And I'm storing the value of setter in the variable set header. All right, now this is convention. It's standard React convention. You can name your variable whatever you would like, and technically you can name your set function whatever you would like as well. But it makes sense to name it set camel casing, the name of the variable. Right? This is standard React convention here. So please don't just put whatever you want in here. Try to be descriptive about the values that it is that you're interacting with. It's going to make your life a lot easier, and make sure that you follow this convention. Whatever the getter name is, you would do set and then the setter name. All right. Now this is how my useState function works. All right. I am currently initializing it, and I could use my setter function to receive an argument and give a new value to header. All right. Now this isn't typecasted. You're not doing any sort of enforcement as to what kind of values are being held in here. So you could do something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if I click this, you would see that 1, 2, 3, 4 shows up. Right? So it was able to accept numbers and still render them within the HTML. But it does run into some complications as to what it's able to render. For example, here in H1, we are rendering the header. Well, what if my header value gets reset to 1, 2, to an array of 1, 2, 3, 4? Right? It still shows 1, 2, 3, 4. And if I come over to my console, let me go ahead and do this here. You can see that it's just joining it and reading it as if it was just a number. Well, that's a complex data type. What if we go into something like array? Or excuse me, an object. I called it an array, I apologize. And I click this. When I get an error, it's going to tell me objects are not valid as React children. Okay, that makes sense, right? We don't necessarily want an object to just show up in there. So typically you want to make sure that if you have a complex data type, you're iterating through that type and only grabbing the values that you want to render, which we'll go into here shortly. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding the useState hook? If no one has any questions, let's go ahead and continue pushing forward then. Now, this useState hook can get a little complicated, especially when we're utilizing it within forms. For example, right now, the way we're capturing our handle submit is very old school, right? It's vanilla JS. We're capturing form data and grabbing all of this information. Well, what if I want to refactor my code? What if I could just do const and then I want to capture Pokemon? What did I name it? Did I just put name? All right, let's do Pokemon name. And then we could do set Pokemon name, make that equal to our useState function, where it's initialized as an empty string. Now I want to use this to be able to capture user input. Gonna go ahead and make this a little bit more readable. All right, so there's my input type. Currently, it doesn't hold a value, it holds a placeholder. But I do want it to do something when it changes. All right, well, I'm going to give it a value of Pokemon name. And I am going to set, excuse me, I'm going to give it an event of onChange where every time this value is changed, I want there to be a set Pokemon name to e.target.value. All right, so we already talked about events quite a bit. This e.target is going to grab the input field itself. And then the value that's currently placed in there is whatever somebody's typing in. When I go into submitting this form, which for now, let's go ahead and comment out this information now. When I go into submitting this form, I just simply want to console.log the value of Pokemon. Let's see what happens here. Can refresh my site. Everything's working. I'll type in some gibberish and I do search. Well, that gibberish shows up. What if I do something like Pikachu? Now Pikachu shows up. And if I change it to Bulbasaur, now Bulbasaur is being displayed on my console. All right. So we're giving it the original value of an empty string, which is what gets initialized for Pokemon. And then we're tracking the changes that are happening within this input field. And for every change, we're reflecting it by setting the value of Pokemon name to the current value inside of this input field. All right. Does anyone have any questions over how we integrated the state or the useState hook into an input field?
Is the E just a variable like that stands for event, or is that specific?
Yeah, that's a great question. So E is a variable, right? We don't necessarily have to name it event. It is common to see in JavaScript a mixture of those. Either you'll see event completely written out, you'll see E as one of the other ways to specify event, or you'll see EVT as a way to specify event. All three are standard JavaScript conventions. Does that answer your question, Cami?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Any other questions? Okay, great. It doesn't seem like we have any questions. So let's go ahead and continue pushing forward here. So now my handle submit method is able to capture my Pokemon name. And now what I want to do is I want to actually grab some Pokemon data. Let me grab this information here. Let me see this function. Okay, well, this function is no longer going to need name as a parameter because now name could be passed in from the state. So I could just say Pokemon name, right? We're grabbing the value of the state, and we're actually going to remove this generate card portion here. Okay, awesome. And there we have a response. Let's go ahead and console.log response.data. I go to Pikachu, I search it, and I never called my function because that would make too much sense. Let me go ahead and call that function really quick. So get Pokemon data. I'm gonna go ahead and refresh it. We go to Pikachu, and there we can see all of Pikachu's abilities, right? We can see everything regarding our Pokemon Pikachu is being able to populate. And we're refactoring our code to include use state hooks now. Great. And you can see I'm not passing it in as a parameter. If I change this to Bulbasaur and I make my search, now all of the information regarding Bulbasaur is coming in. That is because the state hook is managing the changes for our getter. All right. So now I have my data. I can make a new Pokemon thing here. So we can say, hey, now that I have a Pokemon name, I also want there to be Pokemon data. And I could set this Pokemon data to null. This is a primitive data type. And setting it to null is not necessarily bad practice. It's something that you could see. And it gives us the capability to run conditional rendering. Now, what does that mean, conditional rendering? Well, so far, I have this generate card container that did all of this functionality. I'm going to go ahead and drop it in here. All right, there's my generate card container. It was able to generate a card. It would grab the container by ID. It would then create a division, give it the class of card name, etc., etc. Right? Well, let's break down this information. We would get a division that would have the class of card show up. Inside of this division, we would have an image. And we would have an H3 element, where H3 was the Pokemon name that we are searching. Let's see it happening in action. All right, I go Pikachu. And Pikachu shows up inside of that division. Okay, so it seems like this generate card function is no longer necessary because of this state. So I'm just going to actually remove it. All right, we don't need a generate card function anymore. Well, let's talk about this image. In order to be able to grab the image, I'm currently console.logging my data. Instead, I would like to set Pokemon data to response.data. And when I have response.data, I would like my source to be equal to Pokemon data dot sprites dot front default. This is going to break my application. Let's try to figure out why. All right, so it's telling me uncaught error. Cannot read properties of null, reading sprites. Well, that's happening here. Why is that happening?
Is it because you're trying to access the data before it actually has it?
Interesting. I'm trying to access data before it actually exists. Okay. Well, is that an asynchronous functionality problem?
Yes.
All right. So in this case, the issue that we're running into, and it's important for us to read this error, right? It says uncaught type error, cannot read properties of null, reading sprites. Properties of null. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that somehow I try to write something such as null dot sprites. Well, I know that the only place where I utilize sprites is here in Pokemon data. So what is the current value of Pokemon data? Well, Pokemon data is initialized as null. So when I try to say, hey, dot sprites in Pokemon data, it's telling me, whoa, hey, you need to slow down. As of right now, Pokemon data is set to null. Right? And if I try to do the same here, where I say Pokemon data dot name, you're going to see a very similar error. Right? Let's refresh it. We get cannot read properties of null, reading name. Because what I'm currently doing with Pokemon data is I'm saying null dot name, which isn't valid. Right? Well, how do I fix this? Because I know that once the data comes back, it's going to work properly. I just need for this data to actually be displayed. It's not even giving me my form to try to attempt to send my data. This goes into conditional rendering. What I do is, hey, is Pokemon data existing? If it is, I want you to show this division. If it's not, I don't want you to show anything. And then I close it off. Now it doesn't show it. I could refresh it. There's no issues that are being displayed. If we look at Pikachu, Pikachu now renders. And I totally forgot to flip these two. I think my card needs a little bit of design adjustment. There you go. All right. Let's do a little bit of review here as to what's happening. Currently, we changed our input field to utilize the state hook for Pokemon name. Pokemon name is initialized as an empty string. But every time the input value changes, we're updating the value of Pokemon name to whatever the user is typing in to that input field. Once the user submits their form, the handle submit method is going to be triggered. This stops the original functionality of the submit form, and it triggers the get Pokemon data. Get Pokemon data is an asynchronous function, which we talked about yesterday. It's going to send a request to the Poke API for the Pokemon name, which is coming in from that input field. And then we're going to set Pokemon data to response.data. Well, Pokemon data is referenced to down here. If Pokemon data does not exist, meaning it is null, we're not going to render anything. I can refresh this. Currently it's null. Nothing is being rendered. Once Pokemon data is set to a value, meaning my request has been completed, it will then render the division of card with the image mapping to the sprites and the name that comes in from Pokemon data. Does anyone have any questions over how we're utilizing the useState hook to generate content, conditional rendering, or integrating it with our asynchronous request?
Is that conditional rendering block that you had, is that asynchronous because it's waiting for Pokedata to exist?
That's a great question. So it is not asynchronous, right? This is actually tied to the virtual DOM. If we go back to our example of the virtual DOM, right? What happens here is when this renders or my application is rendered, currently Pokemon data is null. So because it's null, it displays as null, right? The DOM and the virtual DOM are on the same page. Well, now I made a state change. That state change signifies that Pokemon data is no longer null. It is now holding an object. And because it is holding an object, this division class is being inserted inside of the virtual DOM. So they're no longer matching. And then the virtual DOM pushes that division into our DOM. Right? So that's our virtual DOM in action. Does that answer your question, Erica?
Yes. So that would have to be like the use state getter to do the conditional data.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Any other questions? Awesome. If there aren't any other questions, let's go ahead and continue on talking about the use state hook. Currently, right now, we're only able to grab one Pokemon. And maybe what I want to do is I want to continuously iterate the amount of Pokemons that I'm fetching and all of their data to demonstrate all of my cards. I'm trying to collect more Pokemon. How can I do that? Well, instead of setting this to no, and I'm actually going to comment out this conditional rendering block. Instead of setting this to no, I am going to set it to an array. And when I set my Pokemon data, well, I'm going to set it to this array of response.data. Well, that doesn't seem to work properly, right? Like that doesn't look right because if I do this, all I'm doing is I'm constantly making one entry. Right? If I bring back or if I try to map through this information and render it, right? So if I do something like Pokemon data dot map, where we have Pokemon, and for every Pokemon, I want to return the division where we have a class name of card. And then I go to show my H3 element, or sorry, I think it was the image tag first, with source to Pokemon dot sprites dot front default. And then we close it. And finally, we do our H3 tag, which holds Pokemon dot name. All right, when I type in Pikachu, it's only going to show Pikachu. And if I type in Bulbasaur, which apparently I didn't spell correctly. There you go. Bulbasaur. Now it's only showing me Bulbasaur. Okay, so it's close, right? I am changing the array. Notice that I don't have to do conditional rendering anymore because if this array is empty, it's just not going to show anything for it. So there's got to be a better way to manipulate this. Well, this is an array already. So by default, I get the notion that, okay, well then I'll just push to the getter response.data, right? And that should set my data. Well, let's do Pikachu, and I do search, and this actually ends up breaking my DOM, where a map is not a function. Okay, well, it definitely is a function of an array, but for some reason this isn't working correctly. All right. Well, if I try to do dot push, maybe this Pokemon data isn't actually returning to me something that I can interact with. If we take a look at the difference between let and const, well, Pokemon data is a constant that can be interacted with directly. So this dot push method would break. Okay, well, that kind of puts me in a weird situation now because how exactly is it that I'm supposed to add anything into this array without losing my previous value? Right? Because that's the issue. Since this is a constant that I can't interact with, I can't add or subtract from it because, again, it's a constant. I need to essentially make a copy of it that I could interact with and then add my value. All right, so let's talk about that. Let's go into add. Let's make a function called add data. And this function is not going to be an asynchronous function. All it's simply going to do is it's going to manipulate with this Pokemon data. We could even have it take in the argument of data. Well, we're going to set Pokemon data to a value. That value will be a copy of Pokemon data. And we can make a copy of Pokemon data by doing an array, which is the data structure that I want to save it in, and grabbing all of Pokemon data's contents. This is object destructuring, or excuse me, this is array destructuring. We're grabbing the contents of an array and spreading them out. We're essentially unboxing them and putting them inside of this parental array. We could think about it like this. We have my original array, 1, 2, 3. And this is my const of numbers. When I do nums, this is simply just grabs each one of the numbers and takes them outside of their array. So now I have 1, 2, and 3, all independent. Right? I took them out of their array by running this 3 dots in nums. Because I do want them to stay in an array. It's just I simply need to make a copy. I'm adding a parental array yet again. And that's how we end up with a copy of nums. Well, now that we have a copy of nums, all I need to do is add my value of data. Okay, so we just switch this function of set Pokemon data to add data. And now let's see what happens when I run my application. Okay, I'm getting some issues here. Cannot read properties of front default is not defined. Let me see. Pokemon.sprites.front default. Okay, that should be defined. Interesting. Let me see here. Ah, there it is. I forgot to take off that parentheses. There you go. And there's our Pikachu showing up. Now it is giving me a warning. We'll talk about this warning at the end because I don't want to run out of time before we call it quits here. All right. Does anyone have any questions over this add data function and how we are setting a new value to set Pokemon data by creating a copy of the original getter and then adding one object? And I'm sorry, I didn't even demonstrate it working. Let's do Bulbasaur. There you go. Now we can do Charizard. Right, all three of them are populating. Does anyone have any questions?
When you use state, it has to be a constant.
Yes, it does have to be a constant.
Okay.
Just so I'm understanding this properly, so the add data function that was created, that essentially is trying to manipulate the structure that the const Pokemon data was generating that could not be read by the HTML display. So you made it more readable by making a copy that matches what you could read out on HTML. I'm just trying to like kind of like word it in a way where I'm trying to make sure that like I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's close, right? So what we have here is an array. We're mapping through the array. The purpose of this add data function is specifically to destructure the original Pokemon data and add an additional value whenever we do set Pokemon data. That's the whole purpose of this function. It doesn't necessarily have to do anything with the HTML.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? All right. Now, there's the removal of an element that we have to talk about now. And the removal of an element from an array can become a little bit complicated. We're going to go ahead and add a button here. And this button is going to say remove. All right, you can see all of them have their nice little button that states remove. All right, awesome. Now for this button, when I click it, I basically want it to remove that data from the Pokemon. Now again, we can't just remove something from Pokemon data, because when we remove something from Pokemon data, we have to actually remove it by creating a copy of the array. So what array method would return to me a copy of an array that's been filtered down, right? Like it's been cut down. The map method iterates through an array and conducts an action for every element in the array. But there's a different method that will actually return a copy of the array that's been filtered down. What method am I referencing to here? We learned it during the functional programming part of Intro to JavaScript and Python. All right, so in this case, the method that I'm referencing to is going to be the filter method. So what we can do is we can grab Pokemon data. We can filter through this array. We can grab each Pokemon. And then I can specify which Pokemon is it that I want to be returned? Well, I want the Pokemon where Pokemon.id is not equal to the ID that I've been passed in. Now, this Pokemon.id, where's that coming from? Well, we can take a look at the Poke API. And here we see Ditto. Where Ditto has the ID of 132. And their ID is unique. All right. So I want to make sure that the only elements that come back are the ones where the ID that the current Pokemon has doesn't match the ID that I'm going to be passing in. Okay, well, we do this again. There's remove button. We'll have the on-click method where I want to remove data, and this expects an ID, so I could go Pokemon.id. Let's take a look at our application now. I look at Pikachu, Blastoise. Let's do Bulbasaur. And let's do Charizard. All of my cards are showing up. Well, what if I want to remove Blastoise? Well, now Blastoise has been removed. A change in the state of cards, or excuse me, Pokemon data was triggered because it is now less than what it was before. So it just renders to demonstrate that change. The virtual DOM forces these changes straight into the DOM through the state hook. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding this add data or remove data method?
Can you explain again how that on-click function is working?
Absolutely. So what's happening here is when I go ahead and click this remove data, I'm going to be passing in the ID of the Pokemon that was selected. So for example, let's do Bulbasaur here. When I click on Bulbasaur, the ID of Bulbasaur is going to be passed in into this remove data method. From there, I'm going to filter down the original Pokemon data to return a new array that only hold the items where this statement evaluated to true. So it's going to grab Pikachu and it's going to say, hey, is the ID of Pikachu equal to the ID that I was just passed in? Well, the ID that I passed in was Bulbasaur. So this is going to come out to no, this was not equal, which is what I'm making sure that it is. So this evaluates to true, returns Pikachu. Then it goes into Charizard. Is Charizard's ID equal to the ID I was passed in? It is not. So this evaluates to true, and Charizard gets returned. So both Pikachu and Charizard are currently in the new array that I'm building. Finally, Bulbasaur is going to be evaluated. Is Bulbasaur's ID equal to the ID that I was just passed in? It is. So because it is, that evaluates to false, and Bulbasaur does not get included in the new array. So now when I click remove, Bulbasaur gets removed. Does that answer your question, Erica?
Kinda. I was also I meant to ask specifically how did you get the Pokemon ID from clicking the button?
Ah, got it. So if I come down below here, all right, originally I have this Pokemon data, which is an array of objects. Each one of those objects, oh, nice, and add, looks like this. All right, so at every index, I have an object that looks like this. I iterate through each one of those indexes in my Pokemon data, and I reference to it as Pokemon. That's how I'm able to grab the sprites for front default. So I come down to sprites, front default, And I can also identify each independent Pokemon's ID. So that's how when I do my onClick function, I pass in the Pokemon that I'm currently on ID. All right, did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. Any other questions? All right, it doesn't seem like there are any other questions. I did go pretty long, so we're going to go ahead and stop the recording here.